This is the Mooks and the Gripes podcast. Hello, everybody. This is Trevor. Furthermore, Paul. Paul, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. We got back in the rhythm. I like it.
Yeah, well, I was listening to the old episodes and realized I am really bad at doing something I said I was going to do.
Yeah. No, I was ready for you. I've had some coffee, so I was on my toes, ready for whatever you threw at me. So, yeah, no, I'm doing well. As we discussed a little bit before we started recording, finished up a rough little stretch at work. So I'm just happy to be back in the world of books and where I kind of belong. Yeah,
this peaceful, lovely place.
Yep.
So I'm gonna just jump right in, and before you even have a chance to ask me, because this kind of plays in. What have I been reading? I finished Anthony Trollop's The Warden last night. Have you read that yet, Paul?
I haven't. It's high on my list of things that I'd like to get to. So what did you think of it?
I loved it. I loved every minute of it. I loved every character. I loved the story. I loved the conflict. I loved the amiable, very wise, omniscient narrator. The way they kind of do things back in Victorian time. I adored the book. And it is kind of about an older gentleman who has a job as being a warden. He takes care of 12 old men, according to an old will. And it starts to come out that maybe the will is not being handled the way that it's supposed to, that it was set up for the benefit of these beneficiaries, hundreds of years ago. But in that time, the property has become so valuable that it's actually the warden himself who is really benefiting from the will, because the will's set up in such a way that whatever's extra goes to the warden, to help them out for their charity. But now it's just a really, really good, lush job. Well, the warden is not a man to just take something that he doesn't feel is his. And so he does start to feel guilty. And as it goes along, you tell that he's maybe kind of like you and me. He wants a quiet life.
Right.
And this distress, the public kind of outcry and the sense that, people don't respect him, but also that maybe he can't even respect himself, really starts to get to him. And there's a part where he goes and he's waiting in London, and he gets to he's just waiting in a room, and there's a couch and some coffee and a book. And I can't remember the exact word. I did mark it, but I won't take the time to find it. But he says something like, "Is there anything more heavenly than a couch, a book, and a cup of coffee?" And so what you're saying there, that's his moment of peace, and he's going to go and grab it as quick as he can. But yes, I adored this book. It's the first part of the Barsetshire Chronicles, the Chronicles of Barsetshire, The Warden, Book 1. And the thing that I'm really encouraged by is that there were a couple of unsolicited opinions on Twitter where I got, well, that is the worst Trollop book to start with.
Yeah.
And I kind of thought, well, I don't know why you're saying that, as far as, is it because I won't get to know Anthony Trollop? Is it because it's terrible? Is it because I'll not read anything else? But I kind of thought, well, if this is the worst, I'm so excited for the rest, because and I think it was that just like, no, you really don't get a sense as to his heights.
Right.
And I'm thinking, oh, this is wonderful. But yeah, very, 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 very good. Would strongly recommend that you get to it as soon as you can.
I'm excited to hear that. I actually traded in some books a few weeks ago, and then I was walking around the used bookstore, with a little bit of credit, and I grabbed that one and the second one in that series, and I've never read any Trollop at all. So
me either. This was my first.
Yeah, that's exciting, because I had seen, I don't know if it was on your feed or if people had seen the picture that I posted or whatever, but I had heard very similar things about the Warden, and so I was kind of like, oh, maybe I made a misstep and got the wrong one. So that is very good to hear.
Well, and one way that I did it, so I had started it twice before, and while I was enjoying it, there's maybe a bit of a hurdle at the very beginning to just, it's a different style than I was used to. It's kind of like rereading, getting back to Shakespeare. It takes a bit to get into the rhythm again, even if you've been there before, I think. There was also a lot of the legalese and things that were going on with the will. So it took a little bit, but the way that I finally got into it and really started to adore it was on Audible. Almost, I think 5 of the 6 books are free. They're included with your membership. and the reader, Timothy W. I should have looked it up. I know it's Timothy W. The rest of the name is kind of scraped off by the only on Audible or
Right.
the included. So I never saw the name, but I'm sure I could find it. But Timothy W. is an exceptional reader. And what I would do is I would sit down and I would open up my book and I would listen and read at the same time. And I loved it. It was one of my favorite reading experiences of the year. And I've had some really, really good reading experiences this year. So I would recommend, if you get a chance, to read it, but maybe also consider giving the Timothy W. Reading a go, because he does the rest of them as well, and I just can't wait.
I've told you, I've used that exact same strategy on Ulysses and a few other books, and I love doing that. I mean, it might work for every book, but especially for certain books, I think that's a really smart way to do it, and it kind of just helps immerse you and gives you little insights into things that you might not otherwise pick up on. So, yeah,
there's such a great performance quality if you get a good performer who can read. And it might be a little different than I would read it myself. Certain characters might sound different, but I just loved it. And if you don't mind, let me find just a small passage.
No, I'd love it.
There is a character in the book who just is really kind of awful. He's the Archdeacon Grantley. And I'm not going to say too much about why he's awful or give you any more of my opinions on him or who he is. But at the end of the book, and I'm not spoiling anything, this is just more about the tone. The narrator says, "And here we must take leave of Archdeacon Grantley. We fear that he is represented in these pages as being worse than he is. But we have had to do with his foibles and not with his virtues. We have seen only the weak side of the man and lacked the opportunity of bringing him forward on his strong ground. That he is a man somewhat too fond of his own way and not sufficiently scrupulous in his manner of achieving it, his best friends cannot deny. That he is bigoted in favor, not so much of his doctrines as of his cloth, is also true, and it is true that the possession of a large income is a desire that sits near his heart. Nevertheless, the Archdeacon is a gentleman and a man of conscience. He spends his money liberally and does the work he has to do with the best of his ability. He improves the tone of society of those among whom he lives. His aspirations are of a healthy, if not of the highest kind. Though never an austere man, he upholds propriety of conduct by both example and precept. He is generous to the poor and hospitable to the rich. In matters of religion he is sincere and yet no Pharisee. He is in earnest and yet no fanatic. On the whole, the Archdeacon of Barchester is a man doing more good than harm, a man to be furthered and supported, though perhaps also to be controlled, and it is matter of regret to us that the course of our narrative has required that we should see more of his weakness than his strength."
I love it.
I know that can be very annoying and cloying to some people, but I loved these characters, and I love that the narrator can kind of present them in this slight way as having a much richer life than even we get here.
Yeah.
And it just shows a little bit of the generosity of spirit of Trollop's narrator. I have no idea about Trollop the man. I don't know. Maybe he was just a wonderful, just grandfatherly, loving figure, or maybe this is all an act, but he acts it well if it is.
Yeah.
And I adored the book. So
well, that's great. I mean, that goes back to something we talked about a few episodes ago, where when you're starting a new author, I think it was in the Cormac McCarthy episode, where do you start with their masterpiece and then all you have left is the lesser thans? Right. Or does it make more sense to start with something that maybe is still solid, but not their most well-known or not their masterwork? And it sounds like in this case, maybe we're approaching it the right way.
I wonder if it's because they just find so much joy in some of the others that they worry that if someone starts with the Warden, they'll think they've done Trollop and move on to something else and never get to the best. But like I say, that just encourages me because I thought the Warden was fantastic. It also is book one of the Chronicles of Barsetshire or whatever, whatever a sequence that was supposed to be. It is book 1 of 6, so I feel okay in starting there and not in like book 6. But
no, I mean, I agree. One of the things that's kept me away from Trollop is just being kind of overwhelmed with where to start, which books are in which series. Do I need to own all 14 of this sequence and all 6 of this sequence? And so that's kind of when I saw that it was book 1, I kind of just went for it because I was like, it may not be the best starting place, but it's a starting place. And
it's also very short.
Yeah, that doesn't hurt either.
Very short.
Yeah.
I think all the rest of them are quite long. This one was like 210 pages in my volume. So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, I took up enough time. Paul, what have you been reading?
Yeah, well, due to the aforementioned work struggles, I won't say it's been my strongest little stretch of reading, but I recently finished a series, so I'm going to count that. It's the Copenhagen Trilogy by Tovah
Oh,
Ditlifsen. You've probably seen that
mm,
a lot around. It's been highly touted by a lot of people, and so I finally got around to that, and boy, it's excellent. Comprised of 3 books, obviously: Childhood, Youth, and Dependency. And so, I read a little bit about her biography, but I didn't actually know anything going into it. Throughout her adult life, she really struggled with things like alcohol and drug abuse, and was even admitted to a psychiatric hospital several times. So I won't say that these are light reads. Again, surprise, surprise. But they start out, especially the first book, Childhood, does start out as kind of more of a relatively straight, just a childhood narrative. They're all memoirs, obviously. And so the first one touches a lot on her childhood and just her growing love of art and literature and poetry. I was reading a review of it that said, she dishes out boilerplate tribulations of the budding aesthete. She scrounges for books beyond the mealy syllabus of the parental bookshelf, has her wistful juvenilia discovered and mocked by her brother, fails to connect with her firebrand friend. So in some ways, it's a very much a coming-of-age story, but she's a really good writer. And I was just going to read this one little section that talks a little bit about she's at the library. And it's something that I think maybe a lot of listeners to this podcast have maybe dealt with, where maybe a bit precocious, trying to read above your level, and having adults basically tell you, that those aren't the books for you. You need to go over to this section. So talking about the librarian, she is tall and slim and pretty with dark, lively eyes. Her hands are big and beautiful, and I regard them with a certain respect because it's said that she can slap harder than any man. She's dressed like my teacher, Miss Clausen, in a rather long, smooth skirt and a blouse with a low white collar at the neck. But unlike Miss Clausen, she doesn't seem to suffer from an insurmountable aversion to children. On the contrary, I'm placed at a table with a children's book in front of me, the title and author of which I've fortunately forgotten. I read, Father, Diana has had puppies. With these words, a slender young girl, 15 years old, came storming into the room, where in addition to the councilman, there were, etc., page after page. I don't have it in me to read it. It fills me with sadness and unbearable boredom. I can't understand how language, that delicate and sensitive instrument, can be so terribly mistreated, or how such monstrous sentences can find their way into a book that gets into the library, where a clever and attractive woman like Miss Mollerup actually recommends it to defenseless children to read. So I just like that part. I mean, not all of the book is kind of light as that, but I like it. It really does a good job of capturing that feeling where you're reading something that's been assigned to you or that is supposedly good for you. And even as a lover of language, you're just like, no, this is not what I'm looking for. Anyway, so that the first one, like I said, is more about that. The second volume, Youth, gets into her as she grows up. She starts to work a series of unappealing, dead-end jobs. And she's also trying to work at her poetry on the side and trying to find a way to get published. And unfortunately, she increasingly relies on relationships to do that, often with older men. So there's another quick quote. I desire with all my heart to make contact with a world that seems to consist entirely of sick old men who might keel over at any moment, before I myself have grown old enough to be taken seriously. So it's really interesting how she's trying to get into this world. But again, it's something we could probably all relate to. It's all about who you know. So she has to compromise some of the things that she would like to do, make some very questionable choices, and kind of leads to difficulties later in life. And then the third book, Dependency, is where it does get very dark. Unfortunately, having read her biography, I didn't read it before, so it's even darker when you know how things end up. But it deals a lot with, she does end up with this man who deals with some of her dependency issues because she gets addicted to some different drugs and things. And he basically uses that to control her. And, it does get pretty dark at the end. But overall, it's just a really, really good series. I can see why everybody was talking about it. And, I would definitely say if you're in the mood for something like that, it's something you should pick up.
So did you read the one that came out here in the States, the FSG book, or did you import it and get the...
Yeah, I read the FSG. It was the one where they were all collected in the hardback. I thought about getting the 3 separate, but I decided to get it in one nice volume. I felt like I'd heard enough good things from trusted folks to kind of take the plunge and go for the hardback, and I'm glad I did. Yeah, so
nice. Yeah, you can import. I don't think that's available in the States as individual volumes, but I think you can import some from other places. Though you can also import the full trilogy in Penguin Modern Classics from the UK. But yeah, that FSG volume was really nice. I haven't read it yet. I'm reading things like The Warden, Paul. Not
Right. I know. I mean, and to be honest, that was one where, do you ever sometimes just go into a book knowing very little about it, but based only on, like, I'm not usually somebody who follows the buzz necessarily, but it's more recommendations of people who I've consistently seen over the years have a taste that's very similar to mine. And so I don't even know really when I started this that I knew it was a memoir. Maybe I did, but I just kind of knew that it was a translated work that was getting rave reviews from people I trust. And I went into it fairly blind. And so by the time I got to the end, I was honestly kind of surprised by the fact that it was this, pretty depressing memoir in a lot of ways, especially by the end. But boy, yeah, it's powerful. And, I have no regrets at all. It's really good.
No, it's one that I've had. I've had it. I think I got an early copy of it, but I haven't read it yet. I want to, and you're making it more clear that I need to.
Yeah,
I've heard that it's pretty important to just kind of an eye-opening. Well done. So there's a bit of that surprise and pleasure in reading it, but also eye-opening and important. So
yeah, absolutely.
Well, all right, Paul. Here we are. You and I are sitting down to record an episode about a publisher this time around, and I couldn't start with anyone. I mean, I have a lot of publishers that I love and adore, but I started a podcast back in 2012 about NYRB Classics, specifically about them, just reading their books and going through them. I think I've reviewed 100 or so on my blog. I look at everything that they release with complete and utter trust that it's going to be wonderful. And more often than not, it is. I love NYRB Classics. And so we chose them to be, or maybe I forced it upon you. Maybe you're like, I kind of hate NYRB Classics. Let's let it out, Paul. Let's let it out. They're going to be listening.
No, so, no drama this time. I am completely on board.
They're wonderful. And they're wonderful people to follow and to engage with online. Their books are quite varied. They have fiction from a lot of languages, as well as a lot of different time periods. They have a lot of really interesting nonfiction about, like, of course, things that we might expect. World War II memoirs are kind of a big thing, or World War I memoirs, and they're really good. They're not. I've never felt the fatigue from them. They have also books about gardening and about just nature and people who go out for walks. And I mean, there's a whole bunch, as well as covering some authors. They have quite a big collection of, say, Robert Walser or Henry Green. They have almost all of his out. There's just one that they don't. And then they have a lot of Sybil Bedford. They kind of pick up on authors and over the years drop out the books as they get the rights or the ability to publish them. And so it's just, they're so fun to follow. And so I wanted to talk today to you about NYRB Classics and about your experience with them. And then we're going to talk about just a few of their specific books. Now, but I'll start here. We could go on forever about this topic, and we could pull out probably 50 books each and still not feel satisfied about where we got to and whether we were able to talk about all of our favorites. And so we have really worked to be disciplined, and we're each going to be talking about 3 of our favorite NYRB Classics books that we would like to recommend. And that's it.
I know. And listeners, I want you to appreciate how hard that was to do. I think we need some brownie points because, I had piles and piles, and I was shuffling and shifting, and
I was changing mine up until the very end of the day yesterday. So I finished The Warden and went to look at my piles again and thought, okay, how am I going to do this?
Yeah.
Which child am I going to abandon?
Exactly.
But we have a little bit of solace in that we'll do this again on NYRB Classics, and we'll be able to talk about some of the other ones. Go ahead, Paul. Tell me a little bit about your experience with the publisher. This can be reminiscence, like the first time you ever laid eyes on an NYRB Classics book. Was it love at first sight? Or
I was trying to remember exactly how I got into it, and if I'm honest, I think it might have very well been your podcast. I might have had them on my radar before that, but I really do think you were very formative in some of my passion for them, because you and I remember your brother would sometimes go through and you would read just from their catalog and read descriptions and just say, that one sounds good. That one, I want to get it, but not right away. And I was sitting there taking notes and marking them on Amazon or whatever I was using at the time. And I do think a lot of that. I'll be curious to see how many today, if any, we have overlap.
Mm-hmm.
For one thing, just because we have similar tastes, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of my original tastes were formed by your podcast. So yeah, I mean, I think what you said is what really appeals to me is they're so eclectic. It's like when you walk into a bookstore that you know is so well curated that you could basically pick up almost anything off their shelves. And even if you, on the cover copy, don't find anything that's especially reaches out and grabs you, you just have that trust. Like, they said it's good, I think it'll be good. And that's how I feel about them when I'm walking down the aisles of a bookstore and I see that little distinctive rainbow colored cover. I get a little thrill still, and I will reach out and see which one it is. And if I don't have it, there's a pretty good chance it's going to end up on my final pile. So to your point, it's just that idea of the curation, the care they take, the curiosity they take about the world, that, you know, there's other countries represented. There's all kinds of various ways of looking at the world. And I don't know, as an omnivorous reader, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a press that does a better job of just scattering out all these little gems that you just never know what you're going to get into, but it's always going to be some kind of treat.
Yeah, they have a book called Good Doctoring, which is actually written by a doctor about how to be a good doctor. I mean,
Wow.
it's very eclectic, you know. And the thing that I love about it is I would never go and read that book ever, just on my own. I would never think it would apply to me. I would never think it would be well done. But the reason that they picked it wasn't because they were like, oh, some of our readers are really going to be interested in how to be a good doctor. It's because the personality there and the writing is so strong that it doesn't matter what they're writing about. You feel enriched, you feel engaged, and you feel like you're benefiting by sitting down and listening to someone who is so good at articulating what they love and what is important beyond subject, and more about being able to get into that headspace. I love that they tend to do that kind of stuff and throw these little curveballs. And yeah, sometimes I realize that it isn't so much, these are classic books that have been read by millions. I mean, just this last month, they released a book called Storm by George R. Stewart, where it's about a storm. I mean, it follows a storm. And I'm like, wow, how did they find this thing? Well, it was pretty famous. You know, it's the reason that we name storms today. It really is. And it's also, the storm in that book is called Mariah. So it is where Lerner and Lowe they call the wind Mariah. So it was pretty well known in its day, and it's George R. Stewart who wrote Earth Abides. So it's not, I'm the one who's kind of out of it by not knowing about it sooner. But at the same time, it does always feel like they're uncovering these little hidden treasures that might otherwise just be lost.
Right. No, that's something else. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's how I feel too. It's a lot of these, more and more there are some publishers who are looking at backlisted catalogs and trying to pull things out of obscurity. But at least as far as I know, they were one of the first to really do it. Like, that was their mission and their goal. That was kind of, what they set out to do. And just the thought of some of these things fading away is just heartbreaking. And so I love that part too. It feels like everyone they pull out, it's just like, who knows what could have happened when you read about the library at Alexandria burning down and all this lost knowledge. I mean, it's not quite that dramatic, but it's the idea that if not for them, maybe some of these books would have just disappeared under the waves and never been heard from again.
Well, and we had things like Penguin Classics. And I love Penguin Classics. They do quite an eclectic mix as well, but they do feel different. There's a different vibe behind each of them. And I went in and met with NYRB Classics folks once. I sat down and talked with Edwin Frank, who's the publisher and who runs, kind of the editorial eye. And he was talking to me about how it came about as very much, hey, let's look at these older books that are no longer in print and figure out what needs to be put in print. There's more to it, and he talks about it in some YouTube videos and things as well, so I'm not going to try to poorly state what the whole ethos behind it all was and how they all got started. But, it started back in, I think, 1999. They came out with some of their first books. They actually numbered their spines back then. And I have one. I found one at a used bookstore that was the numbered spine. I actually pulled it out to have it, but now I'm not seeing it right here with me. It's a Henry James one. And, I don't know, spine 11 or something like that. Kind of like the Criterion Collection.
Yeah, that's cool.
Which also started their DVD line. They had been doing this with laser discs and stuff before that, but in 1999. And
Ah.
I do kind of relate the Criterion Collection and NYRB Classics. They overlap quite a bit, where the book might be the basis for a film that's in the Criterion Collection, or at least some authors' works are, and there's a lot of connections there. But yeah, they used to do spine numbers. I'm kind of grateful that they don't, because, anymore. And I think that was very short-lived. I think they had maybe 15 titles that came out that way before they went with their style that we have now. That uniform, rainbowish, as you said earlier, spine, and then all these fun covers that are it's always so fun to see what they're going to choose for their cover image.
That's what I was going to mention, is just beyond everything else, they're just gorgeous. Like on the shelf, spines only, they're gorgeous. And then you pull each one out. Each one has such a cool piece of artwork that often may not directly relate. Sometimes it does directly relate, but it just has the spirit of the book. And I think it's fascinating what they choose. And yeah, I mean, I love them as objects. I love the insides.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes this is how dorky I am. They have 4 or 5, I think 4 books by Elizabeth Taylor that are already out. And I love their covers. I love these books. I love their covers. And they are releasing later on this year. By the time this episode comes out, I think it'll already be published. But another Elizabeth Taylor, it's Miss Palfrey at the Claremont. Mm-hmm. And for a long time on their website, it said cover image not available. And I would go on there every other day and just like, I want to see what cover you chose for this. They finally did reveal it. Life goes on. I can't wait to have it in my hand, because it's just fun. It's just fun. Listeners, I'd love to hear what your experiences with NYRB Classics is, or other publishers that you love, that you kind of have that trust with. I read widely from a lot of different places. I do follow specific publishers, though, because there is an editorial and curatorial mind behind it often. And I just get to where I can trust them. So I do appreciate it. I'll also say, too, that if you're a backlisted podcast listener, so many of the books they talk about, not all, but a lot of them are books that have been on NYRB Classics' own list for some time. And so if you listen to a podcast and think, I trust these people to lead me to good books, you can do something similar with a good publisher.
Definitely. And one thing that they do that's very dangerous is a few times a year, they'll have these sales where if you get one book, it's 10%. If you get 2 books, it's 20%. If you get 3 books, it's 30%. And oh boy, those are dangerous. I love watching everybody's piles, when the shipments start coming in and you're like, oh, I'm adding that to my next list. And it's so much fun. It's like Christmas morning.
It is. It's so fun to see the piles and see what people were drawn to and just kind of get excited. If I don't know, it is. It's fun. It's fun. And that's why we started this podcast, is to have fun and to have this good spirit of encouraged reading and love for reading. And I get that giddy joy with NYRB Classics books.
I do too. Definitely. I'm on board.
All right, listeners, we're taking just a really quick break in this episode about NYRB Classics for an extremely exciting giveaway opportunity. Paul, I reached out to the folks at NYRB Classics. They've been good friends of mine for many years now. And I asked them, when are your sales coming up for your fantastic book club subscription? You have subscribed to their book club in the past. Do you want to introduce listeners to what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it's wonderful. I've done it for several years now. And basically, you subscribe, and every month you get this wonderful little manila package in the mail that has one of the new books that NYRB releases each month. And as we've talked about in this episode, there's always such a wide variety of great stuff. So to me, it's like this unexpected Christmas morning once a month. You never know when it's going to come. You never know exactly what's going to be in there, but it's absolutely lovely. So yeah, you get a new book every month from NYRB Classics.
Speaking of Christmas, Paul, I think this episode is going to feel like Christmas to somebody.
I would hope so, yeah.
When I reached out to NYRB Classics to ask them about a sale, because I wanted to do this as a giveaway, they turned around and graciously offered to give away an entire year's worth of this book club to some lucky listener without even charging me for it.
It's amazing.
So yes, listeners, this episode, you have the opportunity to win a year's subscription to NYRB Classics through their book club. It's so exciting to me.
I know, it's about as
giddy.
good as it gets. I am too. As I told you, if you notice somebody who shows up in a pair of funny glasses and a mustache, don't think anything of it. It's absolutely not me trying to win this prize.
Who is this Paul Wilson?
Yeah, exactly. It's certainly not me, so don't think anything of it. Now, this is really exciting. I can't believe they did that. It's an amazing gesture.
I'm very pleased. Again, this is 100% their graciousness. We appreciate it. I hope that it makes someone out there happy and also gets a lot of people excited. And in order to enter this contest, I need you to email me at mooksandgripes@gmail.com. The email is in the show notes on your podcatcher. But also, I will put on my blog for this episode a link so that you can email me there. We'll try and make it easy for you to find. If you can't find it, contact me on Twitter at Mooks, MOOKSE. I want as many people to be able to enter this as possible. I don't want someone held up because they can't find my email, even though I've tried to make it readily available as I can. So please email me. And what we're thinking this time, we're not going to give a trivia question. This is about just being excited. It's that time of year to get excited about books. Not that there's a time of year not to be, but it just, this is maybe a little heightened.
Mm-hmm.
Please send us 3 of your favorite NYRB Classics titles, like we're sharing today. And if you have never read one of their books, please send us a reason why you're interested in reading their books. This is open to everybody. We're not going to make any kind of trick. I'm not going to be evaluating your choices and deciding who's worthy to enter. Anybody who enters and expresses, hey, I'm trying to enter this giveaway, all I ask is that you talk about NYRB Classics in your email, either by sharing your 3 favorites or by telling us why you're interested in NYRB Classics. And for a little bit of a bonus, I am willing to put your name in twice if you also go through NYRB Classics catalog that's coming up, their upcoming releases through the next year, and tell me which one you're most excited about.
That's a good idea.
I will put a link in the show notes for their forthcoming selections, so you know what's on their catalog. And like I say, all you have to do to enter is talk about NYRB Classics in your email to me. But if you want an extra entry, please go through their catalog and tell me what you're most excited about that's coming out over the next year. And they don't have an entire year up over there, but
there's always plenty of choices.
There's a lot. There's a lot of stuff out there that looks very exciting. I go there, maybe once a day to see what might have shown up on their site. And yes, it's very exciting. So thanks so much to the folks at NYRB Classics for this generous giveaway opportunity. Listeners, get on it, get entering, invite friends. I know that dilutes your chances, but come on, this is too exciting. It's almost the holiday season. You can be generous. Now, when will we be drawing and selecting a winner? We will be doing that on Saturday morning, November 6th. So really and truly, if you want to be safe, get your emails to me by the end of the day, Friday, November 5th, or any time from now until then. You don't have to wait until then. Please don't. That might be a little overwhelming on Friday, November 5th. But any time up to then is safe. Of course, if I get one right before we make our drawing selection, I'll still count it. So if it's the early morning where you're at, Saturday, November 6th, please still enter. But when we sit down to record, it's over. The drawing is closed and we will make our selection. Any last words on this, Paul?
No, just like you said, thank you so much to NYRB and good luck, everybody.
All right. Well, should we move into our 3 books that we chose to kind of highlight? Not our top 3, not our favorite 3, not anything like that. I just chose 3 books that I felt comfortable recommending broadly to folks. I'm ready to go.
Okay, yeah, I am
how
too.
did you put your list together?
Yeah, very similarly. I chose 3 that I just wanted to highlight that I thought they're not obscure by any means. None of, most of these aren't, especially among listeners. Most of you have probably heard of these. But to me, one of the things I tried to take into account is you and I talk about NYRB in probably every podcast that we've done. And I tried to find some that I hadn't mentioned as much or maybe at all. And then also just ones that I hadn't thought about in a little while, in some cases that I kind of wanted to bring back, not only to my own attention, but maybe to anybody out there that, they're not currently buzzing like some of the other ones. And so I thought maybe it might be interesting to try to pull a few of them back out. So that was my general thought.
All right. Well, let's hear the first one you want to highlight.
All right. I'm going to be curious to see, even among these 3, if we end up with any cross-pollination. But
I kind of don't think we will.
Okay.
We have not shared our lists, listener. No. We have no idea.
Okay. Well, this is one that I suspect maybe, because I think I might have actually heard about it from you, but I don't know. We'll see. My first one is The Vet's Daughter by Barbara Commons.
All right. Yes. I don't know how we did this. I do not know how. There a few years ago, they published their 500th book. Mm-hmm. And they've been publishing steadily since. So I'm imagining they're getting closer to 600. I'm sure they've passed 550. How on earth did we get this? And I've read a lot of those, a pretty good chunk of those. I know you have too.
Yeah.
This is just a powerful book, right?
It is. Yeah, I think that's the main thing. I mean, I do think that you have been a very strong and positive influence on me. So maybe it goes back to something you mentioned in the past. But if nothing else, it's because this book is just amazing. I mean, I'll start out a little bit, but why don't we just turn this part into a little bit of a conversation like we've done a few times. So, basically this is told in the first person. It's the story of a 17-year-old girl, Alice. She lives with her parents in kind of a dingy London suburb. The first part of the book is pretty realistic and straightforward, but it's definitely grim, has a little bit tinge of tragedy to it for sure. On the cover copy, I was looking at it, and Alan Hollinghurst kind of compares it to either Great Expectations or David Copperfield. So it's a young person growing up in less than ideal circumstances. Her dad is a veterinarian, as you would guess from the title. Her mother is bedridden with an illness. I believe it's cancer. So, Alice is often kind of left at the mercy of her father, who's very cruel and sometimes even violent. I had a quick passage here that I was going to read. A young boy called Hank helped with the animals now because I had to do most of the cooking and all the shopping, and see to Mother when Mrs. Churchill had gone home. In spite of the boy's help, I didn't look after Father as well as Mother used to, and he often hit me because the bacon was burnt or the coffee weak. Once when I'd ironed a shirt badly, he suddenly rushed at me like a charging bull in a thunderstorm, seeming to toss the shirt in some way with his head. I held on to the kitchen sink, too afraid to move. He came right up to me, and I saw the whites of his eyes were all red. He was only wearing his vest and trousers, and was dreadfully hairy. He seized the arms of the shirt, and was trying to tie them round my neck with his great square hands, when the parrot suddenly started to give one of its awful laughs. Father seemed to go all limp, and stumbled from the room, while the parrot went on laughing. I thought that was a good little snippet. That's pretty early on, and it gives kind of especially the beginning of the book is fairly straightforward with the narrative, but there's this edge of darkness, and there is almost bits of like a fairy tale quality to it at times that kind of slip in. And so, yeah, I would love to hear kind of your thoughts before I go any further too.
This is the third Barbara Cummins book that I've read. NYRB Classics has released Our Spoons Came from Woolworths. I'm going to say that again. Our Spoons Came from Woolworths, as well as The Juniper Tree, which is a retelling of the Juniper Tree fairy tale. And I read those first and loved each of them. She has such a unique voice, especially with the Vet's Daughter and Our Spoons Came from Woolworths. Man, I can't say Woolworths today. There's this simplicity of the narrator, almost where, and I think this happened, where you'd expect words to be misspelled in it, because it's not that kind of educated voice, but there's something so insightful. There's this ramping up of the inner life coming through all of that just really is I think where these books get their strength, because you're seeing a life that otherwise might be dismissed, and you're seeing its pain, and you're also seeing the very subject dismissing that pain. and feeling like they don't belong, and yet it breaks through in these books that repressed, suppressed, and pushed down and abused voice finally bursts through. And you get a sense of it at the very beginning of The Vet's Daughter. The way that it starts, it says, "A man with small eyes and a ginger mustache came and spoke to me when I was thinking of something else."
I love
She doesn't
that.
say what she's thinking of, but she's just thinking of something else. And here comes this person. "Together we walked down a street that was lined with privet hedges. He told me his wife belonged to the Plymouth Brethren, and I said I was sorry, because that is what he seemed to need me to say, and I saw that he was a poor, broken-down sort of creature. If he had been a horse, he would have most likely worn kneecaps." I just love her little insights there, and the fact that she's going along with someone she does not want to be with,
Right.
doesn't know. Who knows what this guy's motives are?
Mm-hmm.
But that's what she seems to be supposed to do, so that's what she's going to do. As we came to a great red railway arch that crossed the road like a heavy rainbow, and near this arch there was a vet's house with a lamp outside. I said, "You must excuse me," and left this poor man among the privet hedges. I don't know why, I can't quite articulate it well, why that puts me so much in the mind space of Alice, but in that short passage we just get a sense of this strong but forced to be passive, forced down persona.
Yeah.
And the book is kind of all about that, and like you say, gets into this fairy tale element that I don't know, if you look at old covers, the Nyrb Classics cover is actually quite dreary and kind of gross, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but if you look at old covers, you'll see one that's a pretty big spoiler for the book.
I know,
but I love that cover. It just has that quality to it, and yeah, this is a fantastic book.
It
so
is.
I'm glad we both have it.
I am too. No, it's funny because I was going to read a different section, but I was a little worried about the spoiler part of it, because it is one thing that about her books, and I've read the Juniper Tree in this one, and this is definitely the biggest example of it, but I think it does happen in all of her books from what I've gathered, is just there is that straightforward narrative, and kind of what both of us just read is one part of the books, but there is that fairy tale part, or that oddness, unexplained oddness, that is also something that's very appealing to me. I was just looking at a review in The Guardian, and they described it as tragic, comic, and completely bonkers. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And they called Commons something of a neglected genius. And I was like, yeah, that's right. So yeah. I think that completely bonkers part is something that is easy to maybe overlook initially, but I think that's an important part of it. There's this weirdness and this kind of dark, strange undercurrent that runs through a lot of her books that it's hard to describe, but man, it's fascinating.
Well, and it almost, with The Vet's Daughter, that bonkers quality is treated so as if it's so mundane by the character herself, that you realize how much of this is, again, it just kind of emphasizes how much she feels she can't quite engage in all of the big things going on in her life. But yeah, I adore the Vet's Daughter. All right, Paul, you going to do it again? What's another book you picked?
I hope not. The pressure's on now. So the second book,
I kind of don't think so. I don't think we've got any more. Okay. That was the one where I kind of thought, oh, we might.
Yeah.
But I'll go for, I think we're done overlapping.
Okay. Well, if we do, I'll take all the blame for just, apparently being a sycophant and following all the books that you did. The Lonely Passion of Judith Hearn by Brianne Moore. Oh, this book is so good.
And I bought it purely because of the cover.
I know, it's an amazing cover.
When I first saw it.
Yeah, speaking of the artwork they choose, this one is one of the most stunning ones that you could find. So I've read and enjoyed several books by Brianne Moore over the years, and honestly, I would recommend people just dive in anywhere, because I've yet to read anything by him that isn't really good. But this is my favorite that I've read so far. It tells the story of Judith Hearn. She's a spinster woman described, of a certain age. Very early on, we learn through some masterful descriptions that she kind of moves between rundown and sometimes kind of seedy boarding houses. We don't really get too much insight into why, but then slowly over the course of the book, we start to realize she's come down in society for whatever reason. And, she used to be in a much different social status, and now she's kind of, getting accustomed to this new way of living. Moore does such a wonderful job of just capturing her. She's so complicated and damaged. She's kind of just doing the best she can. But beginning with the very first pages, she's going through her morning routine at the beginning, and there's a few parts that just start to give you a little insight. So each morning, it was her custom to sit conscientiously at the mirror, her head bent to one side, tugging the brush along the thick rope of her hair, counting the strokes, thinking of nothing except the act of doing the exercise, her head jerking slightly with each long stroke of the brush. But this morning, hairbrushing actually had to be hurried because it would never do to be late. One's first morning at a new place, especially when there are other boarders to meet. She had said 3, Mrs. Henry Rice. Were they men or women? Maybe, most likely men. And what if one were charming? Her angular face smiled softly at its glassy image. Her gaze, deceiving, transforming her to her imaginings, changed the contour of her sallow-skinned face, skillfully refashioning her long pointed nose, on which a small chilly tear had gathered. Her dark eyes which skittered constantly in imagined fright, became wide, soft, luminous. Her frame, plain as a cheap clothes rack, filled now with soft curves, developing a delicate line to the bosom. She watched the glass, a plain woman, changing all to the delightful illusion of beauty. There was still time. For her, ugliness was destined to bloom late, hidden first by the unformed gawkiness of youth, budding to plainness in young womanhood, and now flowering to slow maturity in her early 40s. It still awaited the subtle garishness which only decay could bring to fruition, the garishness which, when arrived at, would preclude all efforts at the mirror game. So, just so powerful. He does such a good job of just putting you into her mind space. She has so many disappointments in her life. She spends about half of her time trying to pretend it's not happening, but then in these moments like that where there's this quietness, where you can just tell that there's some discontent. And then, over the course of the book, it becomes clear that she's starting to use alcohol to deal with this disappointment and sadness. And so it's heartbreaking, but also in a lot of ways, she's a very unappealing character because Brian Moore doesn't hide any of the warts or the snobbiness or some of the different things. But yet
she's not quite like Alice in The Vet's Daughter.
No, she's not. Yeah. Or even like, somebody in a Barbara Pym novel, at the beginning, you start to think maybe it's going to be this spinster who is just kind of charming. And, she is some elements of that, but there's a darkness to it. And there's some unappealing parts of her personality, but somehow he manages to put you inside of her mind and make her, the seemingly very unsympathetic character, very sympathetic in the end. So I don't know. It's one of my favorite NYRBs, I think, that I've ever read, and I think about it all the time.
Yeah, I really like that book. They have a few other, I think just maybe one other, The Mangan Inheritance by Brian Moore. I haven't read that one yet.
I haven't either.
I've got it on my list to read soon.
Mm-hmm. I would love it if they would publish, like you said, how sometimes they'll get onto one author. I would love to see more from him,
Well, so speaking of, Brian Moore we're recording this, listeners, on August 21st, 2021, and Brian Moore turns 100. He's passed away, but he would turn 100 on August 25th, 1921.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Sorry, 2021. He was born on August 25th, 1921. So his centenary is this year. And yeah, it's kind of too bad that there isn't more attention. It doesn't happen to everybody. It happens quite rarely, it seems, nowadays. But yeah, John Self actually posted an article, shared an article on Twitter where someone said, hey, in a merit-based publishing world, there would be a big line of centenary celebration editions of Brian Moore's books.
Yeah. And
yeah, I know there's a lot more complications than that. There are rights issues, and they do have to make money. If these aren't making money, then it's not simply just, these deserve it, therefore we'll put it out. For all I know, they would love to have, but couldn't, or who knows, or someone else would have loved to. But yes, I've been going through his books slowly, because a lot of our friends on from our very first days on the internet together run like a Brian Moore website.
Yeah.
He's the more the merrier, and all of that to kind of really push his stuff. And they've got me reading him too.
Yeah.
But like I say, I saw that book and was taking it to the counter before I even read the title or the author. I just saw the NYRB Classics book, saw the cover, said this one's coming with me.
Yep, exactly.
And then I found out it was his book, and and loved the book too.
Well, and it's a good problem to have, but with all these books, we both like to read a little excerpt to give people a taste of it. And I was having trouble. I could have read about half that book out loud because, it's beautiful writing. And like I said, just these little snippets into these lonely, quiet lives. I mean, that's one thing I will say the vet's daughter and this one have in common is just lives that would be easy to ignore. And you get these little windows into them. And that's some of my favorite types of literature.
Oh, I was going to say, I'm going to try and change it up a little bit here, but there is an aspect of that in my next choice. So Robert Walser is one of those authors that when I came to know him, I knew he would be an all-time favorite. Susan Bernofsky published a biography of Walser earlier this year called Clairvoyant of the Small, because of how, that's a phrase W.G. Sebald used to describe Walser. Clairvoyant of the small, the way that he can write these mini snippets. He's got some novels, and I first came to know him through the Tanners that New Directions published. But he's got a lot of short stories, and he's got a lot of like little tiny articles. Just this little, they're microscripts that he put together, but also just little snippets that he's writing throughout his life. Oftentimes when he bursts out in the morning, he seemed to just have a well of energy in the mornings to this new day. He enters out into the city of Berlin in Berlin stories, and I think he says, "Good morning, goddess." He's just this burst of energy. But there's so much. There is a tinge of melancholy, and especially if you know where he ends up and kind of his story, it's hard to ignore that in his writing. But earlier this year, they came out with another compilation of his little stories and little, I don't even know what to call them, little essays. And I thought, oh, I'm excited. There's a new Walser coming out. Probably his lesser stuff. They've already published several books by him and compilations. This must just be the scraps. Oh, man, I loved this one, maybe even more than any of the others. It's a little snow landscape. And I love the cover. I don't know if you've seen it, but I do love the cover of it. And the very first little snippet, which I'm going to read in its entirety because it's very short, just blew me away and made me excited to get back into Walser. He wrote this in 1905. He's fairly young, and it's called To My Home. It says, "The sun shines through the little hole into the little room where I am sitting and dreaming. The bells of my homeland chime. It is Sunday, and on Sunday it is morning, and in the morning the wind is blowing, and in the wind all my cares fly away like shy birds. I feel too much the harmonious nearness of home to be able to brood over any sorrow. In the past I wept. I was so far away from my native country. So many mountains, lakes, forests, rivers, fields, and ravines lay between me and her, the beloved, the admired, the adored. This morning she embraces me, and I lose myself in her voluptuous caress. No woman has such soft, such imperious arms. No woman, not even the most beautiful, such tender lips. No woman, not even the most tender, kisses with such infinite ardor as my native land kisses me. Ring bells, play wind, roar forests, glow colors, and it's all embodied in the single sweet kiss of my homeland that in this moment captivates my language in the sweet, infinitely delicious kiss of home." Now, you can critique that from several different perspectives. You can critique the ardorous love for his homeland.
Right.
You can critique some of the weird kissy, whatever. But the part that I love is the energy, and that's how he writes, is this booming energy, this blasting out there. And especially when he gets into this little whimsical stuff like it is Sunday, and on Sundays it is morning.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. There's just something about the way he says that I love. And a lot of his stuff is that way. But again, and I didn't pick out any to read today, he talks in here, though, about his sorrows and his cares and trying to push them away or they go away. As you read more Walser, you come to realize that's wishful thinking. This energy is in part, it seems to me, a desire to get away from what's really troubling him. It comes out often. There's even in this particular volume, there is a section where he's talking about how tiring it is sometimes to have that kind of attitude,
Yeah.
but still finding this joy and seeking that solace in the little things. What is around me
Yeah.
is what it will bring me peace and happiness and joy, even if it's a little bit elusive still. And so I love Walser's work, and I loved this particular edition translated by Tom Whalen. A lot of these are translated by Susan Bernofsky, like the Walser works that they have in their collection. But it's a lot with Susan Bernofsky. Christopher Middleton is someone that relied a lot on to get these, a bit by Damien Searles. And then, but like I say, this one and several of the others, Tom Whalen. So a lot of people doing good work to keep bringing us his stuff, because he wrote a lot before he went into a sanatorium.
Yeah.
But yeah, Little Snow Landscape, just a lot of richness, a lot of unique insights into kind of a deep, sad personality behind it all that nevertheless is invigorating and comforting.
Yeah, no, there's something so admirable about somebody where you, like you said, you kind of know the end, and so you have some insight into what's going on, but to see them living their lives like that and seeking out the beautiful things and trying to build this passion for life, there's something very kind of admirable, but also kind of haunting about that, just knowing the whole story. And yeah, no, that's beautiful. I have to admit, he's one. We talk about those holes in our reading. No matter how much you read, there's those holes. He's one I do not. I've never read a single word by him. I own the Tanners and a Schoolboy's Diary, the NYRB version, but I have not yet read anything by him. It sounds wonderful.
There's a lot. In fact, NYRB, one of their books that I most treasure is his collected stories or selected stories. I don't remember what exactly it's called. That's out of print from NYRB, but you can still get it, I think, from FSG. And that's very worthwhile. Those are tremendous. The Walk, you would find. Okay, here's where I'd recommend you start.
Right, this is what I need.
And New Directions put out one of their little Pearl editions. I don't know if it's still in that edition or not, but of one called The Walk.
Okay,
it's very short, and I think you get that. I think you get a lot of what I love about him in that particular little story.
Great.
So there's my recommendation, but you could start anywhere.
Oh, that's good to know. I have a whole, I don't know about you, but this podcast is dangerous, just like Twitter and everything else, where I have this whole list of adding to my list of books to buy. So I'll add that one too.
Well, even if it all just comes out into the conversation, it's still fun.
Absolutely.
So whether you get to it or not someday.
Right.
Well, we need to hustle. Let's hear what your third book is.
All right. My third book is a bit of a cheat because it's actually 3 books, but it's the Balkan Trilogy by Olivia Manning.
I wondered if you'd pick that because I knew you just loved it.
Yeah, I did. And this was my first kind of group read that I've ever done on social media. Took place earlier this year with Kim McNeil and quite a few other folks. And so it was lots of fun. This was one of those that was might have been on my bucket list books if I hadn't gotten to it. So the group read kind of gave me that little kick I needed to go ahead and jump into it. And yeah, it's so fun. Made up of 3 books: The Great Fortune, which came out in 1960, The Spoilt City, 1962, and Friends and Heroes, 1967. So it's basically telling the story of this young couple, Harriet and Guy, during the early years of World War II. And apparently it's got a pretty strong autobiographical element to it, based on Manning herself and her husband. So, the first book opens with them traveling through Europe towards Romania. They're on a train. They've just married. It was this big whirlwind romance over their summer vacation. They're traveling to Bucharest, where Guy has a job with the British Council at their English department. So, he's a lecturer. He's a communist. He's very passionate. He's one of those guys, has so much energy and passion that he pulls students and other people to him. He's just a magnetic personality. Meanwhile, Harriet, she loves him, but she's starting to realize what she got into. And she has a very different personality. They're very different people, and that comes out more and more throughout the books. So, his charisma draws in all these different people and exposes her to people maybe otherwise she wouldn't have dealt with. And so there's this this section here that I was going to read that just gives a really good insight into this tension that builds between this extrovert who's so passionate and then Harriet kind of getting pulled along in his wake and kind of having to deal with all of that. And I think all of us introverts out here can probably relate a little bit. So she says, "You brought him here. You must get rid of him." And he says, "It's a difficult situation. I was glad to have him here while he was rehearsing. He worked hard and helped to make the show a success. In a way, I owe him something. I can't just tell him to go now the show's over, but it's different for you. You can be firm with him. What you mean is if there's anything unpleasant to be done, you prefer that I should do it?" Cornered, he reacted with rare exasperation. "Look here, darling, I have other things to worry about. Sasha is up on the roof. Yakimov's not likely to see him, and probably wouldn't be interested if he did see him, so why worry? Now I must go back and talk to Toby." She let him go, knowing nothing more would be gained by talk. And she realized it would always be the same. If action had to be taken, she would have to be the one to take it. That was the price to be paid for a relationship that gave her more freedom than she had bargained for. Freedom, after all, was not a basic concept of marriage. As for Guy, he did not want a private life. He chose to live publicly. She said to herself, "He's crassly selfish," an accusation that would have astounded his admirers. She went over to the window and leant out. Looking down the drop of 9 floors to the cobbles below, she thought of the kitten that had fallen from the balcony 5 months before. The scene dissolved into a marbling of blue and gold as her eyes filled with tears, and she suffered again the outrageous grief with which she had learnt of the kitten's death. It had been her kitten. It had acknowledged her. It did not bite her. She was the only one who had no fear of it. Possessed by memory of the little red golden flame of a cat that for a few weeks had hurtled itself, a ball of fur and claws, about the flat, she wept. My kitten, my poor kitten, feeling she had loved it as she could never love anything or anybody. Guy, after all, did not permit himself to be loved in this way. So, just a lot of the book is taking place on a big stage. There's grand events happening, there's Nazis, and there's World War II, and it's all sweeping through these world-changing, events. But I think within that, this quiet person and just the way that Manning is able to kind of capture these little insights creates a great balance between the two. And so there's a whole Dickensian kind of cast of characters, tons of people involved, but then there's these moments of quiet as well that I don't know, I thought it was just amazing. It's a really good series of books, and it's a page turner in many ways, but there's also that depth to it that I really appreciated.
Yeah, I love that trilogy. We did a podcast on it with, I think it was one we did with Nick During from Nyrb Classics back in the day. In fact, it's one I remember well. I'm sitting in this room, and as you're reading, I'm flashback to, this room didn't look the same as it did when I recorded that episode. But I remember I was back on that side recording. Oh, that's kind of interesting how that happens. Yeah. Are you going to move on to the Levant Trilogy?
I was going to say that. I mean, yeah, I am. I have the Levant Trilogy, although this is one of those areas where the NYRB is so dangerous because I have one from a different publisher and they don't match, so that's really bugging me. No, I need to move on to that one because they have that gorgeous edition.
Well, yeah, so you don't have the NYRB Classics Levant Trilogy? Levant. We need to get that for you. You can't. You got to read the NYRB. I mean, yeah, we're doing this podcast. You've read it.
That's right.
You need them to be uniform. I think you'll love it just as much, and that'll always bug you.
Exactly. Yeah. No, exactly. I'm with you. And like I said, that's the problem. Some of these books you have a copy of another one, but then NYRB has one, or they come out with a new one, and you're like, well, I can't have that mismatched copy. That's not going to do. So
I know it's silly. It shouldn't matter.
It does.
But it does, and that's okay. Simon Thomas, one of our friends, does the Tier Books podcast. Mm-hmm. We did a podcast together a while back, and I can't remember what we did it on. Anyway, in that, he said, it's okay. You can have multiple copies of the same book. They're different. There's different parts of you that are satisfied by this.
That's a great way of saying it.
And I thought, oh, yeah, that's true. Mm-hmm. That's true. It is okay. Thanks, Simon.
Exactly.
Thanks. My whole family thanks you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I will pull out my third book that I'm going to recommend, and it is Memoirs from Beyond the Grave, 1768 to 1800. This is just part of the Memoirs from Beyond the Grave, and it's a pretty thick book by François-René de Chateaubriand. This just, I get review copies, and this one showed up, and I was immediately drawn in by the title, Memoirs from Beyond the Grave, by the cover, which is a photograph of Niagara Falls in the moonlight, taken in 1900. Just gives this nice feel. But I opened it up, and as I'm wont to do, just thought, I'll get a sense. And here's what I found. This is the preface by Chateaubriand. written in 1846. So he is, this 1768 to 1800. This is stuff he put together quite a bit later on in life, though he wrote it as his life was going on. He says, "As it is impossible for me to predict the moment of my death, and at my age the days accorded a man are but days of grace, or rather days of rigor, I am going to offer a few words of explanation. On September 4th I will have reached my 78th year. It is high time for me to leave a world that is fast leaving me, and that I shall not mourn. The same sad necessity, which has always held its foot against my throat, has forced me to sell these memoirs. No one can know what I have suffered, having been obliged to pawn my tomb. But I owed this final sacrifice to my solemn promises and to the consistency of my conduct. It is perhaps cowardly of me, but I have regarded these memoirs as private, and I would have liked not to part with them. My plan was to leave them to Madame de Chateaubriand, who could have sent them out into the world as she pleased, or else suppressed them. The latter seems more preferable to me than ever today. If only before leaving this world I could have found someone trustworthy enough, someone rich enough to buy back the shares of the society, someone who would not, like them, be compelled to put my work to press the moment my death knell tolls. A few of the shareholders are my friends, it's true, and several others are kind people who have tried to be of use to me, but finally the shares may be sold. They may be transferred to third parties whom I do not know and whose family interests must come first. It is only natural that my life, so long as it continues, should be an importunity to them, or at least a bother. In short, if I were still master of these memoirs, I would either keep the manuscript to myself or delay their publication until 50 years after my death." And he keeps going.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't want to actually have these out there. I don't want you to read them. I love his voice. On the back of the book, I think they nailed it, whoever wrote this copy. A self-deprecating egotist.
I love that.
That is so true about this man. These are his memoirs, and they start when he's young. And I love this book. It was so much fun. It took me forever to read it because it's pretty thick, but it's kind of done in pieces. Like you can dip into it and just keep going. But guess what? When this came out, I got some people tweeting me saying, "What are they doing? That's not the whole Memoirs from Beyond the Grave," because it says it's unabridged. They're like, no, there's more. And it's true, there is more. This section is unabridged, 1768 to 1800. And, that came out quite a few years ago, and I didn't expect to see any more. But next June, they're coming out with Memoirs from Beyond the Grave, 1800 to 1815.
Oh, great.
And I can't wait because... He's so. I love this guy. I'm probably going to reread this one before it comes out because I loved it so much, and just to get back into his life and capture when we get to 1800. I think he's only in his 30s in the year 1800. So there's got a lot more to go still, and yeah, it's a blast. It's powerful. There's a lot of, there's a solemnity to the whole thing, but I just love how I'm putting this out there because my dang friends in the society are making me, and I'd rather, I need money, but right. Just here you go.
That's funny. So when that second volume comes out, is that going to be then the entire thing, or is there a third, or do you know?
I don't know. It seems like there might be a third because, or maybe even a fourth or a fifth, because this only goes up to 1815.
Wow.
And, he's writing this little preface to the whole thing in 1846. So that's another 30 years beyond that. And I have not looked close enough to see if this really does go several volumes through his life. I kind of hope so.
Yeah. Judging by how thick that first one is, if so, that guy, either way, he's very prolific. That's a lot of writing and a lot of insights.
He wrote a lot of other he was kind of a man about town. He met with a lot of famous people. Yeah, hunting with King Louis XVI at Versailles. Witnessing the first heads carried on pikes through the streets of Paris, meeting with George Washington in Philadelphia. This is just an exciting, this is kind of a good old fashioned adventure story too, or what do they call them? What are Barry Lyndon's kind of a type of this novel, this picaresque novel. There we go. that's kind of what this is like, almost like this development of a guy who's thrown about by history and seems to be everywhere at once, and has a really big attitude.
It's kind of the opposite of all
fun.
those quiet lives we were talking about earlier, at least in
Uh-huh.
in the scope of it. So yeah, I guess our last two books, the Balkan Trilogy and that one, we broadened out the lens a little bit.
Well, which is fair. We certainly have our tastes, and it would be dangerous to suggest that the books we talk about from NYRB Classics represent them fully.
Oh yeah,
but yeah, there's so much fun.
Yeah.
Well, we were going to end this episode not by giving honorable mentions, because again, we'll revisit this. But Paul, at your suggestion, what are 3 that we want to read next?
Yeah.
And go ahead. What are the 3 you chose?
Yeah. Speaking of a difficult task, because this is another one that could have been about 20 different ones. But yeah, the 3 that I came up with are A High Wind in Jamaica by Richard Hughes, Heaven's Breath, A Natural History of the Wind by Lyle Watson. Speaking of kind of their eclectic nature, something that you wouldn't necessarily think about. And then the third one was Season of Migration to the North by Tayeb Salih. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. So those are 3, especially A High Wind in Jamaica and Season of Migration to the North. I picked them up a long time ago, and they keep sitting there looking at me, and they're ones that I've been meaning to get to. I know they both come highly recommended from a lot of people. And then Heaven's Breath just came out more recently, and that one just sounds fascinating to me. Very encyclopedic look at the wind. So yeah, like we were just saying, talk about 3 very different books, all from the same publisher, that all just sound wonderful to me.
All right. We've never wanted to do this officially, but if you start reading High Wind in Jamaica, I'm in the same boat. I think that was one of the first NYRB Classics that I bought, and I still haven't read it. So if you start it, I will dive in, and we'll do that together. All right. The 3 that I chose, I first chose Elizabeth Taylor's A View of the Harbor, because again, they're releasing Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont here in, pretty soon. And I've still not read this one. And the reason I haven't read it is because I'm so excited to read it that I want to save it for some reason. But I have it on my list of things to read. I adore this cover, by the way.
Me too.
If you had a chance to look at that. Another one that I chose is another chunky one, the Kolima stories by Varlam Shalamov. This is the first. They've released another one that's just as thick. More Kolima stories is what it is. And what this is he's a survivor of the Russian Gulag and the Kolima Russian Gulag. And this is a bunch of short fictional tales that go through that time. I can't quite wrap my mind around it. I've not read it yet, but it's one that I feel like I need to and want to dig into. And then I also picked out Natalia Ginsburg's Family Lexicon, because earlier this year I started reading her books. I think I've read 4 or 5 of them, and I've loved them. So it's time to get back to her and to Family Lexicon, which is one that comes with the most reputation behind it. I don't know if it's her best, but certainly one that I think I'm going to enjoy. So those were the 3 that I chose.
That one could have been on my list too, because I read a couple of her books earlier this year, and yeah, she's wonderful. And to your point, that one seems to come up most often, so it's definitely one that I'd like to get to soon.
By the way, I think I asked you this, but do you have Family and Borghesia on your shelf? Do you have that one?
I don't have that one.
Okay, I've got one here for you. I'll say, I think I asked you if you had it and was going to send it to you. I haven't sent it yet. Clearly, it's sitting right here. It'll be on its way to you, so you can add to that.
That's exciting. Something to look forward to. So thank you.
There we go. Yeah. I think I have a few more here that I'll be able to throw in there too, that I'll check on with you as we exchange books. Yeah. Paul and I are wanting to do sometimes.
Absolutely.
So. fun stuff. Well, Paul, we often end with just a short recommendation. I'll be honest with you, I didn't even think about that today. I was so excited to talk NYRB Classics. It's only now as we're sitting down and thinking, how do we close these things usually, that I realized that I left that off of my task list.
No problem.
But did you have something you wanted to talk about?
I mean, I can just touch on it briefly. I guess we can make our big recommendation. Just anybody who doesn't already have a shelf full of NYRB Classics, go out there and start exploring, because it's great. But I did have one that I was this is not going to be anything obscure, but I recently rewatched Roman Holiday, that wonderful
Oh,
movie,
mhm.
with Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck. And I watched it probably about 6 months ago. And then I did something I almost never do. And I watched it again maybe a month or two later because I just loved it so much. I had never seen it before the first time. And it ticks all the boxes. It's so, Audrey Hepburn, everybody knows about her, but she just, every time she's on the screen, you can't help but just stare at her and listen to her. She's so amazing. But the whole thing is just such a wonderful. It's a romp. It's an adventure, but it's not just that. I was surprised by the depth and little bits of melancholy and sadness that are mixed into it that make it much more than what I was thinking it might be. So this one probably doesn't need much, introduction or anything like that. But whether you've never seen it before or whether it's been a while, I would just suggest checking it out. It's on Criterion Channel. I don't know. It's lovely. I love it.
I love that one too. My wife and I watched it a couple decades ago now, it seems, not
Mhm.
quite that long. And yeah, I just remember sitting there thinking that was
It
magical.
is.
And one of my sons, I came home one day and he'd put it in the DVD player and was watching it and was enjoying it.
Wow.
And I thought, what is going on? That was actually several years ago too. It's time. Thanks for the recommendation for me too, because that sounds like a lovely way to spend an August or one of these fall
Hmm.
evenings, is going to Rome and with Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn.
Yeah, it's
So
beautiful. I loved it.
wonderful. All right. Well, thanks, Paul. Thanks, listeners. We will see you here in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mooks and the Gripes podcast. You can follow the Mooks and the Gripes and get show notes and book and film reviews at mooksandgripes.com. On Twitter, you can find Trevor at Mooks and Paul at BiblioPaul. You can also get information about future shows on our Patreon. If you'd like to donate to the show, anything and everything, even $1 a month, helps and is deeply appreciated. You can become a patron at patreon.com/mooks. Until next time.